All right. So imagine a bunch of people were in the atrium getting coffee and the Bible study started late. That's pretty much what happened because I forgot to turn it on for Facebook and I forgot to turn it on for the YouTube channel. And I forgot to turn it on pretty much everywhere except our website. So that meant not many people were watching the Bible study. So I talked for about 10 minutes before Pastor Woodfoot and Pastor Verge came in and said, "No one can see you." I feel like that's probably what it is if I started the Bible study on time downstairs at 9:45 a.m. No one would be there yet because they're all getting coffee. So I just went and got some coffee. Let's pretend that's what I was doing. The resources for this Bible study can be found at ourshepherd.net/resources/news. If you go to our homepage, ourshepherd.net, and go over to the right, you'll see a resources tab. Select news right there. On that page are all the resources needed to follow along with worship at home. That's where the resources are found for everything that we need. And so now I also have my computer with me right here. I can follow along on Facebook, and hopefully there we'll see if you have any questions or comments as we go along. And so if you are have questions during this Bible study, you can put them in the Facebook comments and I'll try to follow along with them. There's about a 15-second delay from the comment appearing on Facebook till I see it. So if you have a really urgent question, you don't need to ask it 5 times. Just wait a few seconds and I will call on you. We are looking at Matthew chapter 5. We're looking at Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 48. The first thing we're looking at is the question of revenge. And as I look at my handout, I realize that I mistyped the opening words of Matthew chapter 5, verse 38. But it goes, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Now, as you wonder, where did Jesus get this from? It's in Exodus 21, it's in Leviticus 24, and Deuteronomy 19. And when Moses is speaking about an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, he's not talking about how much justice you get to give out, but Moses was recognizing that there are tendencies in the human nature for revenge to escalate at algorithmic scale, exponentially. We have the ability in our human sinful nature to take sin and bring it to our desires for revenge and just roll it up. And that is dangerous to society. So when God's speaking through Moses and says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, he's not talking about the level of justice you get to go to, but he's bringing down the escalation of revenge down to a level that brings a boundary to it. And so there's a contrast that's built between a rage of revenge and justice that can be costly to society when we act from our emotions. There can be a danger of when we just allow our revenge and our desires for justice to just go endlessly. There's never a stop to it. So Jesus now brings up these words from Moses, from Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, with this recognition that in their society, these words, an eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth, have been used to kind of give permission to give as much justice as you want up to that, rather than seeing these words as designed to scale justice down to a limit, a boundary. And so there's a contrast. So the first question in our study sheet, and now I do have the ability to kind of share a screen here and give you a chance to be able to see the study sheet as well. So I'm looking now, our first question right here. Question number 1 is, have you looked back in your life and been able to identify when desire for revenge, when it clouded your ability to see the other person as someone created by God? Has it happened where revenge has been all about what you want to satisfy in your heart versus the ability to see the other person? Now, the second reason for Moses' words and what Jesus is reminding us is to keep the scale of justice equal to the crime and that every person is equal in value, regardless of social, racial, or economic status. So an eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth, is actually a boundary on justice that recognizes that everybody is equal in the justice they should get, that a king doesn't get a pass, or someone who is a servant to you doesn't get a harsher sentence. An eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth is meaning that it's the same justice no matter the class of person. So question 2 now. Think about this one. What happens when justice is unequally distributed among people of different social, racial, or economic statuses? Have you seen this in society when there is a justice that seems to be for one group of people and a justice that's for a different group of people? When that happens, when the voiceless are left without a voice in the justice system, you can start to see the need for compassion and empathy, but the need for equality. Revenge is easier to do when justice is unequal. When the person who is in power has the ability to bring more judgment against a person than the person who's receiving the judgment. And so when justice is unequal, the person who is in power has the ability to bring more and more punishments against someone else. And that's a wicked spot to be, especially if you're the one on the end of receiving the punishments. And so Jesus is reminding us of these words, an eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth, to let us know that revenge can't just scale forever up and up and up against another person. There's a boundary to how much retribution we can bring. But he's also reminding us that justice is supposed to happen equally. Martin Luther wrote in comments that Christ is not telling me to give what I have to any scoundrel that comes along and to deprive my family of it or others who may need it and whom I'm obliged to help, and then to suffer want myself and become a burden to others. He is not saying that we should give and lend to everybody, but to him who begs from us, that is to the one who really needs it. Martin Luther's commentary is now stretching to the next part of the Sermon on the Mount. So in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38, it says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you." So I've talked about the two reasons that Moses had limited justice to an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, so that revenge doesn't just exponentially scale up, and so that retribution is equally yoked to all. Now Jesus is kind of bringing us back to a perspective of attitude on this. It says, "Do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you, take your tunic and let him have your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you." All right, so these are kind of hyperbolic statements. That is, statements when taken to the extreme would leave you just getting slapped on every cheek. It would leave you naked as you give up not just your tunic, but your cloak as well. And it would leave you carrying someone else's bags forever. But these hyperbolic statements are pointing to a course of action, but they're also pointing to an attitude to have when confronted by evil in this world. So let's look closely now at each one of these. So verse 39, I'm going to go back to the study sheet. So verse 39, a slap in the face. It's an expression of hate. It's an insult. The insult of a slap is even more important than the pain. And when a person offers the other cheek, he is rejecting the insult's power. When someone tries to slap me, they are trying to exercise power over me. They're trying to show that they have authority to make me feel bad. But when I offer them the other cheek, I'm taking away their authority. I'm rejecting the authority and privilege of evil to define who I am. When I offer my other cheek, I say I'm in power of what I receive or don't receive in this world. Now in verse 40, The image in this verse is the situation of a debtor's trial. Jesus says, if anyone would sue you and take your tunic. So he's describing someone who is suing you. Imagine you have a debt and your tunic was your collateral. And you can't pay your debt, so they're collecting on the security of the collateral and they're taking away your tunic. He says, offer them the cloak as well. The person taken from the debtor will be forced to see the true calamity this debt has brought upon the person. Exodus 22 and Deuteronomy 24 point out a person who gives up his cloak as security for a debt is to receive the cloak back every evening so he can sleep in it. When we collect debts, we're not supposed to leave the other person naked forever without warmth for the evening. And so the image of verse 39 is someone tries to slap you. They want to insult you. You offer the other cheek. Now they don't have the privilege of insulting you. You get the privilege of saying, you can do whatever you want to me. Take this cheek, take that cheek, it doesn't matter. I'm still me. Then if they try to, in the debtor's prison, take your tunic away and you offer them the cloak as well, you're showing them how naked they are making you by collecting on that debt when you have nothing. Now the image of verse 41. This image is about the services compelled by the army or by officials and the attitude we will have toward anyone when they require compulsory work of us. So imagine you have a job and you are compelled to do that job. There is a master-servant dynamic there. But the way we engage powers around us will demonstrate how much we retain our own identity and our own sense of vocation. One way I think of verse 41 is the have to versus the get to. You think you are requiring me to carry a bag 1 mile. You are making it a have to. When I carry it the 2nd mile, I'm making it a get to. I'm showing now my action is not by how much I'm compelled. My action is now done out of love. Love has the ability to disarm. I think in this passage, Jesus is not showing just only the boundaries that Moses had created, how revenge and retribution can't escalate forever. There's a limit. An eye for an eye means not an eye for a body. But he's also showing that the one who is receiving the punishment is not powerless. Our actions in the face of evil can be a protest against the dehumanizing spirals of violence. Our responses can be a demonstration to the other person of our hope for a different kind of relationship. All right, so now I'm on the 3rd page of the handout. And you might be thinking, if I offer my other cheek, there's a risk. I offer my cloak, what else are they going to take? If I show I'm willing to carry the bag not just 1 mile, but 2 miles, how much more are they going to take advantage of me? The person who hits, when he sees I offer my cheek, he can now double up on the other cheek I've offered. And when the poor man offers up his cloak, and the words from Exodus were, the person who takes a cloak as a security for a debt is supposed to give it back every night. There's a risk that the person who takes the cloak doesn't give it back that night and leaves me without shelter. And when the hostile occupying force realizes the advantage they can take of the kindness of people, they can become even stronger. Are we prepared to be radically generous and loving in the face of evil? Or are we going to be continually frightened of the power that evil has and imagine we're powerless? Question 3. To be generous and willing to take advantage of us is to invite abuse. I don't want to invite abuse, but Jesus invites his disciples to trust that they will gain by giving up. How do we hold on to this kind of trust that we will gain by giving up? If I offer my other cheek, what am I trusting in? I am trusting in more than just the person who strikes me to have power in that relationship. I'm trusting that God's got love in that relationship. When I offer my cloak, I'm trusting that God will keep me safe that night. When I offer to carry a bag, not just 1 mile, but the second mile, I'm offering to say that there is power in the dynamic of love that can overcome the dehumanizing spiral of violence. I trust the love of God is more powerful than the spirals of violence. Question number 4. A renunciation of force in our personal relationships, a renunciation, denying that the spirals of violence have more power over me than the love of God has, is a sign that the kingdom of heaven is different. The signature of a sinful world is force and power. What is the signature of a redeemed people in the face of uses of force and power? I think in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 to 42, Jesus is showing there's a signature of love that can overwrite the signatures of violence and hate. When I offer the other cheek, I'm letting it be revealed that love is more powerful. When I offer the cloak, I'm letting it be known that I trust in God to keep me sheltered for that night. When I offer to carry the bag 2 miles instead of just the one that's compelled by law, I'm showing that I can act by love and not by law. All right, now we're going to go to the next spot in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 48. And so here we're going to read from this and get ourselves ready for it. You have heard that it was said, you shall not love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. All right, so in Matthew 5, verse 38, Jesus was quoting from a spot that's in a number of Bible passages. Here Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. There's not a Bible passage that says that. There is, in Leviticus 19, it says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. There's not in the Old Testament an invitation to hate your enemy. But Jesus is commenting that that's become the attitude of the people. You've heard that it said, shows that the interpretation of the Old Testament has led people to the conclusion that you can have an attitude of hate towards other people. Jesus brings correction in an extreme way. And he says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I think Jesus is recognizing that wherever sinners are found, the desire to place boundaries and limits on whom we love exists. Why do you think sin and boundaries of love are found together? So wherever sinners are, there's a boundary on who I want to love and who I don't want to love. Why does sin do that? Why does it create a group of people who are in that I get to love and care for, and a group of people who are out that I get to hate? Why does sin do that? Is it possible that we seek self-righteousness and self-justification, so we find ourselves placing others below us? I don't need to worry about them because they're below me. I want to feel like I'm above everybody, so I place some people in judgment. It could be that I want to have a circle of people who I can trust and love, and a circle of people who are outside that group that I can hate. The commandment to love one's enemy is central to Christian community. Even Roman authorities recognized this radical generosity. This command to love your enemies, it comes from the love that God has for us. That even while we were yet enemies to God, he loved us. There are examples of this kind of love in the Old Testament. It's not Jesus that originated this idea in the New Testament. It was Jesus throughout the Old Testament that also showed this kind of love. All right, so let's think about some passages where there's love for enemies in the Old Testament. This is where I might call on you and say, what are some passages in the Old Testament that you remember where people of God showed love for the enemies of God? Well, I've actually given you some answers in the handout. So if at home you're reading ahead and raising your hand thinking because you know the answer, that's a little unfair because I gave you the answers. But Exodus 23, 4-5, there Moses talks about how we are called to help our enemy when their ox or donkey is injured. 1 Samuel 24 shows David and Saul. David is hiding in a cave. Saul comes, and David recognizes that Saul is his enemy, but Saul is also someone God could be working through. So David shows compassion to his enemy. In Proverbs 24, 17-18, it says, "Do not rejoice when your enemy falls." The Germans might call that Schadenfreude. Proverbs 25 says, "Give your enemy bread to eat and water to drink." We think of the Geneva Convention and how when there's prisoners of war, we have an obligation to care for those prisoners, and we expect the same for our prisoners when they're in war. There are examples in the Old Testament of love for enemies. There's an example in the New Testament of love for enemy. That's the example of Jesus' love. Christian love is comprehensive. And Christian love is concrete in deed and attitude that matches those actions. One thing I think about is how quickly Christians can seem to have an ulterior motive when they love someone else is to turn them into a friend. I'm going to love them, and I'm going to almost like a love bomb so that they have to love me back. That's not why Christians love, to kind of create some sort of transaction. I love them, and then they'll love me back. I think most people can see through the transparency of that kind of love and see the motive. Jesus rejects the notion that there's a sector of this world you can love and a sector of this world you can hate. All right, so let's think about some questions here. When Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy," he speaks of kind of a future tense. But then when he says, "I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you," that's present tense, and it's an imperative force. All right, so looking specifically at this text, verse 43, future tense, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." That's all about what you're going to do in the future. Someday, I'm going to love my neighbor. Someday, I'm going to hate my enemy. When Jesus talks about who we are in the kingdom of heaven, he says, right now, imperative, present tense, you're going to love your enemies. You're going to pray for those who persecute you. What do you think it means to move to the present tense imperative? How much does that say about how Christian communities right now should be characterized by love instead of just saying, someday I'll do that? Present tense imperative. Right now, love. Number 6, question 6. How does love, even for the enemy, reveal that Jesus' disciples are the Father's adopted sons? Because that's what he goes on to talk about how, verse 45, "So that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." The idea is that you've grown up in a household. You've grown up in a household of faith. You are a child of God. So look to how your Father loves, and as a child of God, love the way your Father loves. He makes the sun rise on the good and the evil alike. He causes bread to be on the table of the good and bad alike. So if you are a child of God, if you've been adopted into the household of faith of the Heavenly Father, then act like your Father. And if we start to act like we hate our enemies and we want to bring revenge and persecution upon those who hate us, we're not mimicking and following after the ways of our Father. Question 7. In verse 45, Jesus' statement begins, "For if you love those who love you," it prepares us for a moment of self-examination, that behind our love is often the motive of reward and recognition. What should motivate the love that Jesus calls his disciples to have in this world if it's not reward and recognition? How about it's just to love? All right, question 8. How does love for our enemies reveal the apex of all of the commandments? This is kind of that thing where we said that the Christian community has long been known about the centrality of love for a neighbor and also love for enemy. How's that the apex of the first commandment? The peak of what God calls us to be, to love God and love your neighbor. Your neighbor is not always your friend. Your neighbor is not always the one that you are a companion to in this world. Your neighbor is whomever God has placed in your path. When Jesus comes in the flesh to be the love of God in this world, and he loves us, he doesn't just love those who are his disciples, and when his disciples are doing everything right. The apex to love your enemies is to see how God's love is for all. All right, so a little strange to do Bible study online, partly because there's not as much interactivity as I hoped. My plan is during the week, there's going to be some moments when we use maybe Zoom, WebEx, Google Hangout. We're going to use something. We'll post those on our Facebook page. We'll get them out through our website. Something to think about is on our website, there's lots of ways to get news. Some of the news on our website is kind of static for those moments when we are doors wide open kind of people. But if you go to our website, ourshepherd.net, you'll see the left tab. It says OS at Home. That page, OS at Home, is where we're going to place all the updates on worship services, Bible studies, Google Hangouts. That's the central home to go at to see how OS, Our Shepherd, is doing this at home kind of experience. Each week, we're going to be doing probably some things not the same as last week as we figure out things that are working and not working. But I encourage you to also help people who aren't on technology. One of the things I've been worried a lot about is the people in our church who aren't on Facebook and YouTube and able to get to a website. And so this upcoming week, as pastors, we're going to try to identify everyone that might be vulnerable in home, someone who might live alone, that we think might not have easy access to technology. And we're going to call them, and we're going to make sure that they have some people caring for them. They've got neighbors or maybe people in the church who are regularly checking on them. If you want to be a part of that system of checking in on people in the congregation and seeing what needs they have, let us know. Reach out to us. My email, the rev.ev at ourshepherd.net, woodfins at ourshepherd.net, all the pastors' emails to help kind of share with us ideas or ways you want to help connect. They're all found on that OS at Home page as well. All right, let's close our Bible study with a prayer. Heavenly Father, though I often fall short of your perfection, and I seek revenge and retribution, I struggle to love my enemies. Forgive me. Forgive my sins for Jesus' sake, and strengthen me for greater service in your world. Amen. Thanks for being here. God's peace. Bye-bye.